Tonight, as Kamala Harris makes her closing argument that it's time to turn the page away from the divisiveness that led to January 6th, I want to make two important notes. One of the officers who was attacked on that day will be back on the job at Kamala Harris's speech tonight, near where Donald Trump fanned the anger of a crowd and so close to where he stood at the front of a police line at the Capitol. His helmet ripped off by one rioter, another blasting him with pepper spray as he was crushed with a stolen police shield. Rioters trying to stop the certification of the election. But also today, one of the loudest voices of election denialism, known agitator Steve Bannon, has been released from prison. This picture, taken by our next guest, capturing his early moments of freedom. It comes in the closing days of a campaign that has been so strongly defined by the issue of democracy, and with questions about whether he'll head straight to a Trump rally in Pennsylvania to further fan the flames. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard is here with me in studio. Also with me, New York Times national reporter Jeremy Peters, who spoke to Steve Bannon this morning after his release, and the officer I mentioned who will be working the speech tonight, Metropolitan Police Officer Daniel Hodges, who is joining in his personal capacity, not on behalf of the department. And we'll talk to Officer Hodges in just a moment. But Jeremy, because you were outside that federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, when Bannon was released, I wonder if what he said to you suggests he is not going to go quietly for the next 7 days or beyond.
I would not expect him to go very quietly. In fact, within several hours of his release in the early morning hours today, he was already on his podcast, War Room, which has been, of course, one of the primary sources of election denialism in the country. It's also one of the most popular, one of the largest following among political podcasts. And in an era when conservative media doesn't have the giants like Rush Limbaugh anymore in the audio space, guys like Steve Bannon have filled that vacuum and now carry a tremendous amount of influence and power in the MAGA sphere. What I expect to see from Bannon, what I heard from him when I interviewed him right after he was released this morning, is he's focused on closing the deal, helping Donald Trump close the deal with voters. I think that they realize, as Bannon does in the Trump campaign, the election is extremely close. They're not taking anything for granted. And the way that they see closing that deal is to focus on the economy and show voters, convince them that what Trump did when he was president put them in a better off financial condition, that things weren't as expensive and life was generally better. And so I think that's kind of the positive messaging that you can expect to see from them. Now, on the flip side of that, I think that's up to Trump. And he is always so unpredictable and so volatile and cannot help but put his foot in his mouth in delicate moments like this when he needs to be on his best behavior. So really, it's up to him how disciplined his campaign is for the next week.
So, Vaughn, you've talked to Steve Bannon before. You've interviewed Steve Bannon before. But Mike Davis told the New York Times that Bannon would come out of prison a week before the election like a roaring, caged lion. What do you make of what we heard on his podcast, and what's your expectation?
Right. Jeremy's been on the front lines of tracking Steve Bannon's trajectory up until this point. And I go back to a conversation I had him with Steve Bannon the day before he went into prison for this 4-month sentence. And it went back to 2020 and his efforts to overturn the election. He had 4 phone calls on January 5th and January 6th with Donald Trump, which he refused to tell the January 6th Select Committee members what the contents of that call were. He refused to tell me what the contents of that call were. But he's been open that he was, in fact, trying to keep Donald Trump installed as president in 2021 by forcing several electors from several states to not be certified by Mike Pence and have, therefore, the U.S. House vote for the next president. And because of the makeup of the House at the time, they would, therefore, in his mind, select Donald Trump. And that's what takes us here to going toward the future. Because for Steve Bannon, I'm told that come Election Day, he is going to be at the Willard Hotel, which is where he was on January January 6th. He has been instrumental in keeping all of these MAGA world allies to Donald Trump together and in cahoots to ensure that Donald Trump is able to get back into power. I want to let you listen to a part of his podcast just a bit ago.
On November 5th, we have to crush them at the ballot box. All that matters right now in places like Pennsylvania and in Michigan and in Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, obviously other states, but these 7 battleground states, is to deliver something that takes us to where Ohio and Florida are today. We have to put this beyond their ability to steal it.
And where Bannon is trying to win this election is by getting those Trump faithful supporters and turning them into Trump voters, because Steve Bannon, really dating back now the last 2 years, was on the front line of the strategy. The way that Donald Trump wins this election is not so much by convincing women voters to come back to the Republican Party or winning over the independent voters or the suburban voters, but instead to juice that turnout of the rural, perhaps non-college educated white part of the electorate, and
get literally every Donald Trump
supporter to the polls, and a few more Black and Latino voters, and then you win the election. That has been Steve Bannon's strategy, and we're seeing the Trump campaign now deploying that here in these final days.
Yeah, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, Jeremy, but I wonder what his thoughts are if that doesn't turn out to be, crush them at the ballot box. If that doesn't happen, if Donald Trump finds he has similar numbers to 2020, or he just loses by whatever margin. What role does Steve Bannon play? What did he say today?
When I spoke to Steve, I asked him, as the person who first and foremost suggested that Trump deny the results of the election on election night in 2020, Steve was the guy who said Trump should go out there and declare victory no matter what the numbers say. I said to Steve, will you suggest that Trump do that again? He said if he thinks Trump thinks that he has the numbers that he had in 2020, he absolutely should get up there and say, I won. And that will set in motion, depending on the outcome of the election, if indeed Trump has not won, a course just like we saw in 2020, where Donald Trump does not accept the fact that he lost, does not accept the results as they have been certified and validated. So that is a pretty precarious and, quite frankly, dangerous situation to be facing, even before election day. And we're talking about, a guy here who in 2016, Trump was not saying that he would accept the results of the election when he was asked. So, I think at this point, we shouldn't expect Trump to do anything reasonable or rational, because everything that we have seen points to one reaction from Donald Trump in his history, and that is, if he is losing, someone else has to be cheating. And I see no reason that won't be the outcome, regardless of what the votes say on Election Day.
Jeremy Peters, I know you were up overnight to get that picture and to talk to Steve Bannon. So I thank you for staying up to be with us. Vaughn Hilliard, as always, thank you so much.